The Heritage Foundation's Richard Stern.
Well, thank you so much for participating today and joining us in our event. Now, why are we here, of course? There was an election on Tuesday where as somebody who describes themselves as a democratic socialist got elected as mayor of not just New York City, not just the largest city in the United States, but at the end of the day, the leading commercial and cultural hub of the world, as New York has been for 3 centuries. Now, why does this matter? Because it's an election heard round the world. This marks not just something that will be frankly tragic for residents of New York, but it also gives you a sense of where the world is going, where the country is going, where a lot of these political movements are headed. So what we're doing here today is a talk about not just the rise of bad economics, not just the election of a democratic socialist, but what does socialism mean? What are the ideas behind this movement? What we have to face is that socialism is politics of envy and entitlement. What they call themselves are believers in what's called the labor theory of value. Really, the short version of this is that if you do something, you demand that you are paid for it. These people believe that simply because they ascribe value to something, that it has value to others, so much so that they're willing to steal your money to force you to finance what they're doing. They don't care whether it actually services those around them. They don't care whether it leaves a positive and lasting legacy. But socialism is about more than that. It is a rejection of one of the most basic truths, which is that none of us are perfect, we are all finite, and that everything we do comes at a trade-off. The work of economics, the work of the free market system, is to figure out how to balance those trade-offs to make everybody better off. And at the end of the day, what we believe in is a service theory of value, that value comes because you have performed a service for those around you. If you believe, as I do, that each of us was created in the image of God, each of us endowed with natural rights to freedom, to be able to build, to dream, to aspire, to do for others what we are called to do, that is the system, the only system, in fact, that gives us prosperity. One centered around freedom, around allowing people to follow their passions, to do as they know is best for themselves, for their families, for their communities. We should not turn away from that. The free market process is one of faith, that deep faith in the way the world works, in the way that people will build and innovate. All of the things we have came from those entrepreneurs and those innovators. And it has made America, of course, the beacon of freedom, prosperity. It has allowed us to lead the world through capitalism to end absolute poverty for most people on the planet. But it has also provided the material means to indulge some of these beliefs we now see, as we've seen the majority of New York voters do, which is accept the products of a free enterprise and free market system, but reject the methods. So please join me today with some of my other colleagues here as we get into the details of this. First, I want to introduce John Peluso, who will give you a rundown of a lot of the work we've been doing, looking over both Mamdani and socialism broadly, and then 2 of our other colleagues will join us for a panel discussion afterward. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Richard. I want to start off today talking about something that is very, very, very important to me, and that is to kind of use a story. And it's a story of an article that quoted with this statement: "You'll own nothing and you'll be happy." This phrase originated with the World Economic Forum. It tweeted it in 2018. That tweet was a showcase of the Global Future Council's predictions. And of those predictions, 8 of them were for a world in 2030. The first one was this phrase, and it continued on saying that, things will be delivered to you by drones. You'll rent most of the things that you own. The U.S. won't be the world's leading superpower. Meat would become a rarity. Mass migration, a bunch of other things. But the one that they ended with was that Western values will have been tested to the breaking point, and that checks and balances underpin our democracies and they must not be forgotten. If any of these predictions will come to pass, it will be that one. And ironically enough, it will be from this idea, from the idea that ownership and property rights are not important. Now, this idea has an origin. It specifically comes from an article that was written by, I believe it's Ida Auken. It's Danish, from Denmark. And she wrote this article, "Welcome to 2030, I own nothing, I have no privacy, and life has never been better." In that article, she says, "Welcome to my city," or should I say our city. "I don't own anything, I don't own a car, I don't own a house, I don't own any appliances or any clothes. Everything you considered a product has become a service. We have access to transportation, accommodation, food, all the things that we need in our daily lives. One by one, these things became free, so it ended up not making sense for us to own much." Now, obviously, that kind of prediction is utopian. We don't have flying cars just yet. We live in the real world. And so I wanted to start off with this article for two reasons. Because Ida is a democratic socialist, and Mamdani is a democratic socialist, what she points to is a forecast. And she points to the forecast of a world where ownership, where property rights, where those things aren't being respected. In fact, the utopia is without them. And unfortunately, it's pointing to the fact that people are starting to believe it. So as we go and talk about Mamdani and democratic socialism, the likes that we have seen embraced in New York City this Tuesday, it's important to understand that this is a longer history of an idea. And the socialists are back. They just got a new face. So let's take a look now and talk about what exactly socialism is. Socialism is a socioeconomic philosophy that critiques market systems, capitalism especially, as exploitative. It challenges capitalism, proposing to overcome it and to replace it. It says that markets are prone to interference, domination, that they're inefficient and inequitable. Now, as an economist, I take umbrage with most of those statements. But it's important to understand that this is their claim, and we're going to combat that today. But what are they offering as a replacement? Well, what they're offering as a replacement are these sorts of policies that we've seen both in the United States and also there's ideology throughout the world. The Green New Deal is a great example of this. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez talking about the Green New Deal. You look at universal healthcare, universal and free healthcare, higher education, free higher education. Ultimately, all of those are reducible to an expanded social safety net, to a massively expanded social safety net. And these things are largely vague as they've been communicated to the American people. They're not living in the hard, real world of what is going to happen tomorrow. A great example of this is the Green New Deal. If you looked at the actual text of the bill, it's like 14 pages, I believe, in the House version. So if you know anything about how long and complicated bills are, it's a bunch of promises. It's promissory notes. But Mamdani is unique in that he, as running for a mayor, has to be very specific because these people want to hear specifically what he's going to do. And because of that, we have the ability to talk about Mamdani's highway to serfdom. His highway to serfdom, his rollout, his plan for us to move away from private ownership, to move away from the market system that has made New York the city of the world's desire. So to answer that, why, going back to the original question of why socialism doesn't work, we need to talk about what market economics actually are. Market economics have been lambasted as selfish. And the first and most important thing we need to talk about today is that markets are actually selfless. If we could know this, because in order for you to generate value, to be paid. There has to be a mutual exchange. You helping one person, and by helping that person, they benefit you. That mutually assured benefit is really the core of a market. And we see that by looking at these assets by wealth group. As you go up the wealth scale, a larger and larger proportion of what those people own is in business equity. And businesses are the organized structure that individuals engage with in markets. And so markets are fundamentally selfless. You're improving others by engaging in the market. It's not the selfless socialist versus the greedy and selfish capitalist. And there's a bunch of other components here that we need to talk about with markets, namely that they're free. You freely engage in them. There's no coercion there. As a consequence, they encourage virtue, especially in a service-based economy where your value is tied very much to you. They're proactive. This business equity that was the reward in someone's wealth for satisfying a need, a deep need in the market, largely that comes from being proactive in solving people's needs. And then similarly to this, they're anti-authoritarian and they're fundamentally American. And that's why it's such a tragedy to see it in New York City, see democratic socialism rise up. With that said, why is socialism spreading? And I want to point, there's a lot of reasons, but I want to point specifically to this one. It's the increasing cost of living. These numbers are for New York City specifically. So if you lived in New York, January 2020, and you compare that to January 2025, your rent would be up 17% on average. Your food costs would be up 25%. Your cars would be up 30%. And that home price, this one's very important to me, because though nominally the sticker price of a new home might be up 68% price per square foot, if you include financing, right, and you include the increased interest rates, the way that people actually purchase those goods and services through financing, it's actually up 144% in New York. Same house, 5 years later, same percent down. And so these are serious issues, and I am confident that everyone has felt these sorts of issues before. And because these are so universal, it's important to note that the establishment among the left are recognizing this. Hakeem Jeffries said this, specifically that Zohran Mamdani is relentlessly focused on addressing the affordability crisis and explicitly committed to being a mayor for all New Yorkers. It is in that spirit I support him. In the spirit of what? Addressing the affordability crisis. And in addressing the affordability crisis, he's talking specifically about the economic platform of Mamdani. So I want to make a very quick clarifying statement. There is a difference between democratic socialists and social democrats. That distinction is largely in endgame. So democratic socialists are going to be saying that we should be focusing on, are fundamentally socialists, and we should be focusing on replacing the capitalist substructure, the free market substructure that we have. Social democrats will accept that to a degree, but argue that we need to massively improve the welfare state and massively increase the amount that it is. The important thing to note is that it's a game of jargon. You can move back and forth very, very, very quickly, and we've seen that a lot when you press individuals who identify as democratic socialists on these issues. But we see also that both groups are using the products of the market system. They're taking what market economics gives while undermining it. Welfare state is unsustainable. The democratic socialist wants to go and replace the systems that we have. And so there's four pillars that I think are really important to identify ideologically here with this newer movement that we're seeing. It's an anti-American movement for socialism. They say that the government can and should operate market alternatives. that the government can and should punish wealth. It should override market costs, and it should issue endless debt. And we're going to be talking about that in the panel discussion today. Specifically, going down, we can see this in Mamdani's policy proposals. Government grocery stores, massively increasing public transportation to such a degree where he's going to be competing with the free market, government housing, universal childcare. These things are directly Mamdani saying the government should be operating these market alternatives. The market might have something, but we're going to be doing it as well. Similarly to this, we can see it in his punishments to wealth, particularly his seizing from landlords. This one is very despicable. He writes in his policy platform that they want to use litigation, acquisition, and financing, particularly those two, litigation and financing. Litigation forcing a landlord to sell their property to the government because they deem the landlord not good. And same kind of thing with financing, foreclosing on a house and taking that from someone. And then, of course, you have the millionaire's tax, that wealth that has been acquired and earned through engaging in free market enterprise is not deserved of the individual. Similarly to this, we have overriding market costs. We see this a lot in his housing proposals. His rent control and rent freezes, the wealth stabilization program that New York City has, the rent stabilization program that New York City has, fundamentally is taking 40% of all the apartments in New York City and saying the government doesn't need to abide by market costs, doesn't need to actually let landlords charge market rates. They can avoid them. Similarly, his 30 by 30 minimum wage prevents the market from setting the price of wages, and that harms young people the most. And then, of course, and this is an issue very important to me, issuing endless debt. The amount of debt that New York City is going to incur is astronomical. New York City already has the 10-year capital strategy, and that strategy is already going to bring their debt-to-tax ratio up to roughly 14%. That's the projection. The New York City affordability threshold is 15, and Mamdani wants to add an additional $70 billion on top of that to build more city-run, government-run houses. Ironically enough, New York City has a 10% debt limit constitutionally. That is supposed to be their limit. And so as we are going to explore these things and talk more specifically about the policy, it's important to understand what we can do as conservatives and how we can address them. The first and most important thing is to embrace free markets. They are moral, they are good, they are effective. They will lower the cost of living if we embrace them. And the other thing is we need to cut out and point out central planners as being fundamentally flawed. There's not going to be Zohran Mamdani or any other socialist that comes after them that will be able to actually go and seize the means of power and change all of the rules of the game, get it so that everyone's life suddenly becomes utopia. That won't happen. And so as my colleagues come up to join me on stage and talk about some of the work that we've done together, I'm very excited to get into the nitty-gritty. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all again. And John, thank you, of course, for excellently walking through all the different myriad issues and the things here, of course. Mamdani has a very long platform, very ambitious, as all central planners usually are. So I want to ask you first, I know you were touching on this, and we've been bringing it up, but why is it so critical that we not lose that free market, free enterprise process in New York City in the wake of this election?
Well, New York City is important culturally. It's very important culturally. It's not just that New York City is the largest metropolitan district in the world by GDP. It's not just that New York City is so, important. It's 3.5% of GDP in the United States. It's not that. It's that culturally, if we lose New York, we're, especially the home of Wall Street, we're losing so much of the cultural importance that the United States means to the world. The phrase, if I can make it there, I can make it anywhere, really won't have meaning if Mamdani is able to go and undermine the market system, undermine the market principles that are so essential to America.
No, absolutely. And that reminds me, of course, if you can make it there, well, I hope socialism politically doesn't make it there, even though it's gotten a toehold. But, talking about that, hitting on some of the other notes you brought up, Rachel, I want to turn to you. So, it's understandable, of course, that people are frustrated by the high cost of living. We've seen prices go up, John, as you had brought up. So, obviously, the Democratic Socialist Mamdani have proposed sweeping and crushing taxes and wealth redistribution and government-run grocery stores, which we'll get to later, and all of these other central planning devices. But if this kind of crushing government and mass movement of assets and resources, if that doesn't work, then tell us, what are the kind of solutions they should be looking at to really bring down the cost of living?
Yes, thank you. And so the crux of what's seemingly wanted in New York is to say, things cost too much, it's hard to get by, I should be able to take money from somebody else to pay for what I want, or I should be able to count on the government to provide something for me that I want. And in your remarks, you said that socialism is about envy and entitlement. Well, if that's not working, then I think we need to look to replacing envy with dignity and entitlement with liberty, and people will be much better off. When you think about, if I'm upset because I don't have enough money, my paycheck isn't high enough, what's the problem there? What somebody earns is a product of what they produce minus what the government takes from you. And so you look to what you produce. My favorite economist, Thomas Sowell, how do you make it in life? You learn a skill that people will pay you for. How do you learn that skill? Well, maybe we should look at systems instead of throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at higher education, when you could get a skill through a career and technical education college or through an apprenticeship program that will actually pay you. We want to mandate higher wages so that employers must pay you a certain amount. Well, when you look at what's actually happened across the states, we've had lots of states that have significantly increased their minimum wages, and surprisingly, lower income earners have had higher gains in their wages in the states that did not change their minimum wage, because how to learn a skill, it's education and it's experience. If you can't get your foot in the door and get that first job and start climbing the career ladder, then you're not going to have higher wages. And then just on the option of choice, and get rid of this entitlement, and then I'm going to count on the government to be the provision for something for me. Look at childcare. Not everybody has the same preferences for childcare. They don't all want a government-run, center-based childcare for their children, but that's going to be all that will be offered in New York City. So instead of that, how can we look towards reducing regulations so that there are actually more providers and more options of providers, including the neighbor down the street who's operating in her home, and in-care providers tend to be about 25% less expensive. They're also more flexible. They might have part-time options. So I think it's more looking towards expanding the supply of these things as opposed to the government taking control of that supply.
I think beautifully said. And one of the things, John, you put a graph in the presentation earlier showing the distribution of wealth by income group. And a lot of people think of wealth as being something that the wealthy just hoard, that they use it for their own devices. But the truth is, we know that most of that wealth really are businesses. And if you do the things you're talking about that they're doing, if you impose these things, Mamdani wants to place a new tax on millionaires, which might sound good to some, but really it's the tax filer that represents a small business that he's putting this extra tax on. He wants to bring corporate taxes in New York City from 7.25% to 11.5%, meaning that for New York City corporations, they could be facing a 40% combined corporate tax rate. So, when we do those things, it just means that you're destroying these businesses that are the places you're talking about where people come to work, where they can apply those skills. What I always like to tell people is that capitalism preserves the ownership of capital, but actually lets the workers use it. Where socialism, in its misguided attempt to redistribute the capital, destroys those tools, destroys the earning potential of people. So, John, I wanted to ask you, obviously, if these things come to pass, and there's a lot of other things, the debt burden you're talking about, if this happens, are we going to see an exodus out of New York City? Do we have other things we can look to? Now, look, I'm from Florida personally, and I welcome anyone to come there. But tell us a little bit about what we've seen so far.
Oh, well, there's a lot there. So I'm from New Jersey. New Jersey's a very high-tax state. I'm not staying in New Jersey right now. And I feel very, very, very grateful to do that. And the reason why I bring that up is because Mamdani, specifically on the corporate tax rate, specifically was like, I want to bring it up to New Jersey's level. So he wants to reduce the competitiveness of New York's businesses. And that's going to affect everybody, going all the way down to the very real wealth flight that will happen with a massive increase in taxes. You're going to see, I think it's like 2 million people have left New York State over the past decade. There's periods of time over the past 5 years that New York City has lost population. And so that trend will continue. In fact, it's going to get worse under Mamdani. And as those people leave, the people that are stuck and left behind are going to be dealing with more and more and more of the burden, the taxes, and there's going to be less people, so they're going to have to personally take on more, and it's going to harm them the most.
Which is quite tragic. So I want to get down into the weeds on some of these things, some of these industries that are likely to be harmed. Nicole, I know you've been looking at a lot at the grocery store issue and these central planner ideas of having state-run grocery stores. Can you talk to us a little bit about the economics of it, behind the theory behind it?
Certainly, yeah. Zohran Mamdani, he plans to implement 5 government-owned and operated grocery stores located one within each of 5 New York City's 5 boroughs. These stores will be run for no profit, essentially meaning they're going to be burdening taxpayers. They won't have to pay rent, they won't have to pay property tax, already putting them at an unfair competitive advantage in the market, obviously compared to the private sector and small grocers who have to pay rent and property taxes. Those are huge costs for them. But the government stores will also be keeping prices artificially low. So these stores and big government socialism in general are not the solutions to New York City's affordability crisis. They're actually going to exacerbate costs in 2 specific areas. The first being the burden to taxpayers, and the second being pushing out local competition. So talking to that first point, well, who bears the financial liability for the private versus the public sector? For the private sector, obviously grocery store owners and other stakeholders are directly liable for whether or not their grocery store succeeds or fails. But for the public sector, for the government, the taxpayers are on the line. The government is certainly not using its own money. It's using your money, taxpayer dollars, to finance their programs. And oftentimes we see that government use of funds, especially since it's not their own, is oftentimes inefficient and it's not used well. The second point is the pushing out of local competition. So these government stores are going to keep prices artificially low, and we know from basic supply and demand, when prices are low, the demand for those goods rises. So local competition will not be able to compete with these low prices. They might try to lower their own prices. They still have to remain profitable. I mean, private grocery stores they're on razor-thin margins, only 1% to 3%. So they really won't be able to remain profitable if they lower their prices. So they'll look to cut costs in other ways, and that will be through terminating employees, relocating to lower tax, lower cost jurisdictions, or just going out of business altogether. So those 2 main points, the burden to taxpayers and then pushing out local competition, is not only negatively impactful to the economy, but it will be negatively impactful to all New Yorkers.
And I think this is quite an important lesson about all of this. And as we look through, as you talked about, grocery stores already have almost a 0% margin. And those extra burdens, as you're talking about, people forget this, but burdens on businesses turn into one of 3 things, as you pointed out: higher prices for consumers, lower wages for workers, or less growth and less investment in producing more and making more available. Now, a lot of people might look at us up here and say, well, but that's just economic theory. So, my next question for you is, do we have some real-world examples of tragedies that have been done where governments have actually pursued these and done this? Do we already have a roadmap that we can point to show what's going to happen?
We absolutely do, and that's definitely a good point. You've hit the nail on the head perfectly there. It's not just an economic theory that these sorts of policies fail, but it's also in practice, and we can look to history. For example, in Baldwin, Florida, they opened a government-owned store in 2019, and they were forced into closing after never breaking even. The government even came out and said that it was costly to taxpayers, that it was too hard to run, and this really cements the fact that the private sector simply does it better. We can look to Erie, Kansas. That was another example within the US. They opened a store in 2021, but they were forced to close after less than 4 years of operating at a net loss. And they eventually actually returned that store to the private sector. So that's sort of comical in a sense that the government intervened in the market. We saw market distortions. It was burdensome to taxpayers, and then they just released it back to the private sector, who once again is better equipped to handle the intricacies of owning and operating a business. So those are the American examples, but we can of course look to international and historical examples of what happens when we seek to nationalize industry. When you put the government in charge of food supply, and the Soviet Union is a very valid example of what can happen in that extreme sense. And I'd like to highlight the anecdote of Boris Yeltsin's 1989 visit to a supermarket in the US. I think it was a Randall's grocery store in Texas, but he wanted to see what the American grocery experience was like. And in this American grocery store, you obviously had abundance. There were options available to consumers, and that was obviously not the case in the Soviet Union, which had empty shelves, which had shortages. And that led to the rationing in the bread lines that we saw in the Soviet Union. So while that extreme example might not be the immediate reality for New Yorkers, it is certainly possible in the long term. So we have to look to economic theory, we have to look to history, we have to look to these real world practical failures when coming up with policy solutions, because big government socialism is not the answer. We have to look to free markets.
Absolutely. And you know, that's actually one of my favorite stories about Yeltsin. And for those of you that don't know, you should go look it up if you don't. You know, he came to the US right at the end of the Soviet Union, and we wanted to impress him. And so we toured him around to all these, you know, aerospace plants and showing him all this high technology we had in the US. And what he privately told his aides on the plane back home, and he actually broke down emotionally over this, is that grocery store visit was the thing that got to him. Because, you know, the big factories and everything else are impressive, but for him there, as you're talking about, in the Soviet Union, they could not make something that we take for granted, a real food supply system, function at all. And so, you know, it's an important lesson that we take for granted these things, that we can walk into a grocery store, that there are a million items on the shelves, that they're largely affordable. But at the end of the day, it's an incredibly complicated system. You need entrepreneurs, you need people with the passion and the skill to make these things work. And as you talked about, look, as a native Floridian, if the government in Florida couldn't even make it work, no one can. But I will tell you though, I've heard that Boston has a version that they've done that some people think is successful. Can you walk us through, is this real or is this an illusion from the central planners?
Absolutely. We've definitely seen a rise in socialism in the last decade, and as you mentioned, the Boston example, they opened their store about 2 to 3 months ago, and proponents of these government grocery stores have been saying that, well, this experiment has been a success. But what is their metric? Their metric is essentially saying that 20,000 people have been served within 2 months of the store opening and operating. And that is a terrible metric. That really does not tell us anything about the success of the store. A better metric, for example, would be a profit to cost ratio. I mean, how much is this store making versus how much is it costing consumers? We could also look to things like, well, how long are the lines? What is the cleanliness of the store? What is theft like in the store? Are there shortages? Are consumers able to go into these stores and buy everything on their grocery list, or are the shelves empty? So there are definitely some concerns over the metric that Boston is using, of course. And additionally, obviously using taxpayer dollars, just pumping money into a store or a program might artificially stimulate it in the short term, but that is obviously not a sustainable long-term solution. Socialism and big government intervention is certainly on the rise, but it's not the solution to affordability. Free markets are the solutions. Supply side growth policies that expand the private sector are solutions. Ones that promote fiscal autonomy, ones that encourage competition, and ones that allow people to essentially keep the fruits of their own labor, and that encourage and allow economic mobility. We want individuals to be self-sufficient. We don't want them to be reliant on the government, because when the government takes over, you essentially lose your freedom. So free market policies best preserve socioeconomic freedom.
Absolutely. So, Rachel, after Mamdani solves the food crisis by inflating prices, stripping people of their rights, and destroying the grocery store system, he's going to move on to childcare. What could go wrong with that? So I want to ask you, he's put out a lot of proposals related to childcare and things that relate to that. Can you walk us through some of the economics of his proposals and what do you think the likely outcomes are going to be?
Yep, so it's Mamdani's the nanny now. He wants to take over and have government childcare, but it's going to be free. And I can understand why this is compelling and why people want to see that. Like, childcare is really expensive and it's hard to find, and it's hard to find the type of care that you want. But if you have free government childcare, what is that going to look like? But just looking at the economics of childcare, it's expensive because you are paying somebody else. You have to pay the wages of the workers who are watching the children, and there are rules about how many teachers need to be in every classroom, and there's the physical space, and we all know that rent is extremely expensive in New York City, and it's only going to, costs are only going to go higher under these proposals, even if he's making somebody else pay for it. And so childcare is expensive, and the most expensive type of childcare is center-based childcare, and that is all he is talking about, is government-run center-based childcare. The way to have more accessible and affordable childcare is to have those other options that I talked about. The family base, the in-home, even just living closer to neighbors. Those types of childcare is when you get the costs down, but regulations drive up the costs. And so even those home-based childcares, we've seen the number of them decline by 50% since 2005. And that's because of all these excessive regulations. And knowing I've had children in daycare and seeing the regulations that get put on, how they have to roll the cribs out because a new regulation came and now they have to buy all new ones. Or at one point, they were thinking about having to buy 12-passenger vans and having a car seat for every child in the center in case there was an emergency and they needed to transport them away on an everyday basis. I mean, that would have been, $100,000 for each of those vehicles. Fortunately, they didn't go through with that, but there's so many regulations that just add up to make the cost of childcare higher and higher, and we can only imagine all those regulations that are simply going to make childcare even more costly in New York City. And it is not making childcare more affordable if you say it's free simply by increasing the costs and making somebody else pay for it.
This is a great point on this, that government intervention is the thing that keeps producing the problems that require government intervention, right? Now, I know you've modeled one of these other costs, which is the push for raising minimum wages, the $15 an hour, $17 an hour. But Mamdani said, hold my beer on this one. He wants to go to $30 an hour. Now, can you walk us through what do you think that's going to do to some of these costs, to how already hard it is to afford these things, but not just exacerbating childcare costs, but also the grocery store issue and many of the other economic systems that New Yorkers rely on?
Yeah, and that's what I was exactly thinking about when Nicole was talking about pushing out the private grocery stores. If they have to increase their costs, I think the minimum wage right now is $16.50 an hour in New York City to $30 an hour, and you have 1% to 3% profit margins. What's that going to do to the cost of those groceries at these private grocery stores? They're going to skyrocket, and so then everybody's going to be at the government ones and the bread lines, and they'll go out of business. But on childcare, I've modeled this before when we've seen policymakers look at what would, $15 per hour, $17 per hour, because childcare is somewhat unique in that it's so labor intensive, and you can't have robots, taking care of children or anything like that. And so the costs have to be fully absorbed by the families who are paying for them. And I guarantee you childcare providers are not making high profits. So it's not like you're just going to lower the profits. No, it's all going to be pushed onto the family members. And so I've modeled what would happen in New York City if you get to a $30 per hour minimum wage, and that's going to increase childcare costs by over 23%. So already in New York City, it costs about $26,000 per year for one infant, about $21,000 per year for one toddler. So we're at $47,000 per year if you have two children in childcare. Under Mamdani's proposal, the immediate impact would be $58,000 per year. But if you look out to 2030, we're talking about $75,000 per year to have two children in childcare. And as I said before, like, oh, it might seem like it's going to be free to me, but it's not free if the cost is just more and it's better cost all the taxpayers. And that's the reality is you cannot tax the millionaires and the billionaires enough, even if they stay in the city. This is going to require European level taxation on middle class families who are already paying about 2 times as much in Europe as you compare to the middle class in the US. It's equivalent to about an extra $12,000 per year for every family to pay for Europe stuff. And their childcare isn't 100% free. So it could be even higher here in New York City.
And I think the real life examples of these give you the stark reminder that at the end of the day, the government can print money, but it can't print stuff. The services that take care of your children, to build houses, schools, to be able to put food on the shelves, a roof over your head, all of that requires the ability to really produce things. And when governments say, well, I'm going to throw some money on the table, they create inflation, they create these problems, but they don't actually produce the real resources you need. Now, I want to talk about, now that we've figured out how he's going to tax New York into oblivion and deal with childcare and fix the grocery stores, now we have to turn to the other topic Mamdani is going to solve, housing. Of course, not a small part of the economy at all. So, John, I want to talk to you about this because one of the things you brought up that I think is a critical aspect of this is it's not just that Mamdani is going to raise taxes, but he's going to increase debt levels. And that's the other thing governments can print is more debt. We have $38 trillion of it already from the federal government level. That's $270,000 per American household. It's a lot of the reason why we've had the inflation we've had. But can you walk us through, at the level of New York City, what do you think the proper way is that use municipal bonds, how Mamdani is planning on using them, and how that gets into this plan he's got to have not just housing, but government housing?
Oh, yeah. There's the housing proposals. First of all, housing in New York City is crazy anyway. But housing under Mamdani is going to be insane. Because already you have 40% of the total rental units in the entire city being run by being under the rent stabilization scheme. And the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, being made up of 9 different members that get elected over the course of time, be nominated by the mayor. Mamdani's not going to be necessarily able to do the rent freeze that he wants to do immediately. But if he does it, rent control is one of the most well-known and well-understood policies in all of economics. The meta-analysis is kind of unanimous on this issue. While it is effective at preventing rents, because you're mandating by law those units can't raise prices, everybody else sees their rents goes up. Why? Because you're artificially restricting supply. And the more you restrict that supply, the harder and harder and harder it is for the average person to be able to get an actual apartment. You need rationing. You need these governmental systems that they have employed already in New York City and are going to need to be relied on more for those rent-controlled units, and everybody else is harmed by it. So that's a thing. And then specifically in regards to the debt, the amount of debt that Mamdani wants to issue is astronomical. For reference, there's 170,000 units that New York City already has that they own and operate. The Housing Authority in New York City says that they need over 20 years, $80 billion to maintain and fix their own stuff. Mamdani wants to build 200,000 units with $70 billion. Now, granted, that's over 20 years for their New York City's need, and Mamdani wants to raise that money in 10 years. But that is going above and beyond the reasonable level that a city can afford. And that is well documented. Again, it goes against the stated levels of the New York State Constitution. And that's a serious, serious burden that's going to be leveled on everybody, and it's going to be leveled on them for generation after generation after generation.
If I can just add here, anytime that you see where the government is taking a bigger and bigger role in an industry or a sector, trying to make it more affordable, it ends up being less affordable. That's the case with cities around the US that have tried things like rent controls, and we look at healthcare and the amount that the government is spending there to try and bring down the costs for Americans. Well, why does it cost about $2,000 to get LASIK surgery that is not covered by healthcare, health insurance, but it costs about twice that much to get cataract surgery that's essentially a similar procedure that is covered by health insurance? Why does higher education sometimes cost 6 figures, whereas an apprenticeship program that's run by the businesses is free and you get paid to do it?
No, absolutely. And it's one of those where we keep forgetting often that when government jumps in and subsidizes the way you're talking about, that even the federal government, state governments, city governments can distort these things, waste resources, send people down rabbit holes that lead to more poverty, not more prosperity. And John, I want to ask you another related to this, of course, is, a lot of people don't know this, but the municipal bonds that New York City has and other state and county governments and city governments have are subsidized by the federal government because they're tax advantage. So, Mamdani knows this. He's planning on using this to use basically a, indirect federal subsidy to finance these plans. So can you talk a little bit more as well about how you think that tax advantage status is going to play in these real estate markets in New York and the rent markets, and how you think the market will respond to that and what it'll do to these programs you're talking about?
Well, as the markets respond to these things, you're already seeing developers recognize that they're not actually able to build in New York. They're looking at the regulations, they're looking at the way that the debt is going, because they were essentially under the assumption that in order for them to get the tax advantage themselves, they would need to go and have somewhere around 20% of their units be rent stabilized. So the amount of debt that's being issued, it's being issued, one, like you said, kind of in a subsidized way, and two, the market already responds in the sense of they see increased cost across the board for everybody that isn't in the rent stabilized units. And developers are concerned about building. And you have people who are fiscally minded concerned about the amount of debt that's being issued by the city. And then you have people who are leaving, and as that leaves, well, all of a sudden the debt burden per person goes up and up and up and up. And so the whole market overall is going to react, I think, very, very, very negatively in ways that we've already talked about, where they're going to flee. You're already seeing wealth flight, you're already seeing development flight, you're already seeing that in anticipation of Mamdani getting the reins of power. So I think that's going to be exasperated even more.
Absolutely, but at least for the moment, they have somewhere to go, which is the rest of the country for the moment. So, with that, and appreciated our conversation here, I want to open it up for audience questions that come in. We've got a few in the queue already, thanks to devices like this that, of course, we wouldn't have without the innovators and entrepreneurs we're talking about who are now under assault from Mamdani. So the first question I want to throw to the panel here is from one of our audience members: why should someone like myself living in Alabama feel impacted by this? Also, how can someone like myself spread awareness to the threats of democratic socialism within our communities and not become complacent because we might not live in those regions and because they live in heavily red regions? So,
I think I can start on the fiscal side. There certainly is a fear that these policies would spread, maybe not that far south, or at least not immediately. But thinking about the risk with all this debt that could be taken on, and what if New York City goes into bankruptcy and there's a request for a federal bailout and that gets spread across all of the US taxpayers? Or what about the fact that already we have a state and local tax deduction at the federal level that just got increased, and that those that are in the lower tax states don't get much from it, but it subsidizes instances like this. It makes it easier for New York City to raise taxes because the people paying them get to take part of that off of their federal tax bill, and everybody else essentially pays that.
And I'll bring up one thing about that. So one of the things we're talking about here is there's something called the state and local tax deduction that people in New York in these high tax states, New Jersey, sorry, John, can take $40,000 of their state and local taxes off their federal taxes. And it's exactly that kind of subsidy you're talking about that all of us are paying. Even if you live on the other side of the country, you are indirectly in that way subsidizing all of this work from those politicians. And so in some ways, by allowing these politicians to get elected in these places, by not fighting against it, as our viewer was talking about, by becoming complacent, we pit states and counties against each other. But anybody else want to?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is the whole country matters. There's a sense of camaraderie that we should have as Americans. It should be a crying shame when we see people embrace bad ideas. So I think it's important not only to have that empathy, but also to recognize that those ideas will be spread throughout the United States. Mamdani is offering a policy platform that other people will emulate. And you might not necessarily even realize it, because as those emulations happen, those get baked into those smaller local elections. You might not necessarily realize, it might not be a congressman running in Alabama or Georgia or any of these other more southern states who's like, oh, I'm a democratic socialist. But it might be the local person running for a school board who says, I want to go and I'm inspired by what I see by Mamdani. And those things are impactful. And so we should be coming out full force against them, both in our rhetoric, by defending the market system and saying that it is moral, it is good, and then also on the facts and saying these things that Mamdani wants to do are not going to work. They are going to harm New York. And if they're tried in other parts of the country, they're going to harm them too.
And so the next audience question I want to bring up, which I think relates to this, is what do you attribute to the rise of socialism? Now, I'll give you kind of my short answer to this and then open it up, of course, for all of you, which is that I think at least part of this picture is that America was founded very much as a settler nation, as a pioneer nation. And so the people that came here, and this is something that de Tocqueville came and talked about in the 1830s, that he was blown away by the spirit of entrepreneurialism in America, that America was a place that people went when they wanted freedom because they weren't afraid of what freedom might cost them, but they wanted what freedom could give them, that they felt that they could build a future that they wouldn't be able to do in the constricted, tyrannical places in Europe. And I think one of the tragic things we've seen is that as a myriad of things have happened over the last several decades in this country, I think chief among them is perhaps the expansion of the federal government into every inch of our lives, stealing a quarter of our paychecks, is that it's dimmed that spirit, that many Americans now don't feel like the future is theirs, that their destiny is in their hands. And I think that in any population, if you remove from them that sense of entrepreneurialism, that sense that they have control over their lives, that they can build and innovate, then they'll turn towards these false idols of central planners that guarantee results. But of course, we know, as we're talking about here today, that those are false promises from supposed experts. But that's my answer as to why I think it's rising. But I want to hear your thoughts as well, of course.
There's only one addendum I'll add to that, because I think you hit the nail right on the head, which is you can see this mathematically. You can Google, how many people have started a business in the United States? How many people, percentage-wise, are entrepreneurs in the United States? And you can compare that to different European countries, and you can see that there's a significant difference. That entrepreneurial spirit is innately American, and it's why Mamdani, if he's able to do what he wants to do, which is come in and effectively rob that spirit, is so harmful. Because that spirit is fundamentally American in the same way that our market economic system is fundamentally American.
And I would just add to that, on the education side, that there needs to be more foundational teaching in this. And yes, economics is like a high school or college level course, but you can bring that down to elementary school and just walk through the basics of this, understanding how socialism does not work.
And actually, we did not plan this. The next question I've got here is, how do we reach and educate young people? And how do we give them this information? And how do we teach them to recognize the difference between capitalism and socialism? And the piggyback off what you're talking about, for me, and we talk about it at Heritage a lot, is the public school system has turned into these indoctrination facilities, frankly, that peddle the views that we're now seeing on display in New York City, and this belief that's frankly dehumanizing, that strips people of the spirit you're talking about, that gives them the impression that they need the government to do this, that they need these so-called experts. One of the reasons why our colleagues at the education team, Heritage, have pushed for school choice so much is exactly that, to give parents back control over that education, to allow them to go find schooling systems, teachers, and materials online and in print that can actually give them these deeper, permanent truths that we know are real, that in my mind were so core and bedrock to the way America was founded, and something that tragically a lot of people, a lot of institutions have forgotten and put aside. But certainly feel free to jump on as well.
I think that you're absolutely correct there. I think one specific thing when we talk about education is knowing history. I mean, we brought up the examples of the Soviet Union. What about communist China? What about socialist Venezuela? Knowing the real historical events, knowing the impacts of socialist policy in the real world, not just in economic theory. It's obviously, we can prove that as well, but knowing history is very important, because if we don't know history, we're bound to repeat the past.
Yeah, and I think that's looking at some of these things like equality. Of course, that seems like a great thing we are talking about. We don't want to have major wealth inequality. That sounds good, but socialism is equally impoverished. It's not, equally prosperous. It's the opposite of that. And so I think that the schools need to take these steps one step further, as Nicole said, and actually look, what does society look like in a socialist country?
Absolutely. Well, and I'll tell you, we've got a question here from somebody from Boston who says, how can somebody like myself, living in a state dominated by Democrats, fight for fiscally responsible policies, fight against some of these things, but do it effectively at the local and state level?
Oh, the best way I would say to do that is through actually talking with people. So most people, they get into their voting booth, and they hit that part where there's no longer a party line, and then they start going on their phone trying to look up people's names, figuring out, what did this person say about my school board? What did this person say about X, Y, or Z issue? And trying to go over there and research that. So I really think the best way to do that is to actually have the conversations with the people and do the hard work that we saw people like Charlie Kirk do of convincing people. That will be very good, especially young people. Young people are going to be saddled with the consequences that Mamdani and people like him are going to do. Their policies are bad for them. They might seem good to them in the short term, but the ultimate end outcome is it will harm them greatly. And so it's really, really, really important to speak to young people and speak directly to them and say, you might feel X, Y, or Z, but this is the reality of the situation, or this is why this particular policy is bad. So I think you can do that education and doing the hard work of really convincing people. I would say that's very good in an area where you are a political minority.
I think you're right about that. And I will tell you, I lived in Massachusetts for a time myself, and I think you're right about that, which is it's important that we actually go out, that we speak our convictions. One of the things, and I say this in a lot of different circles, and for my colleagues, they've heard me say this a lot. You're going to hear it now from me today, which is that I actually think one of the most interesting and important moments that happened in human history, frankly, was early Christians being willing to evangelize, not just to random people in the Roman Empire, but literally to go evangelize to people who were throwing their fellow Christians to the lions in the Colosseum. And it's that level of conviction and willingness to know that anybody can learn these things, that we understand that all of us are made in God's image, that all of us have the capacity to learn these truths. Having that conviction to go talk to people, to spread what you believe in, I think is so powerful here. And that's frankly why we do what we do every day here. So with that, thank you all for coming out today. Thank you for joining us today as we talk through the election on Tuesday, what it means not just for New York City, but what it means for the country and, in fact, for all of the world. So again, I want to thank you all for coming and for listening. And that's why we do what we do here, because these ideas matter. As the adage goes, the pen is mightier than the sword. And it is important that we engage these things, that we talk about them, that we not just be complacent, that we not just ignore what could be easily viewed as an election in a city that we don't live in, but it's something that is on the global stage and important to address. So thank you again for your time. Thank you all for your time as well.